Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And we're going to carry on our discussion about drugs and start our discussion about toxicology. Toxicology being the scientific determination, identification, and quantification of drugs. But we finish our discussion about drugs themselves first. We finished off with talking about the derivatives from the opium poppy, and that is morphine, heroin, codeine. These are substances which are extracted from the opium poppy, and we refer to them as being opiates. Opiate refers specifically to something which is derived from the opium poppy. But we also have to discuss this whole huge squad of drugs which are synthesized, not from poppy, but which have effects just like morphine, or effects which are very similar to morphine. And these we refer to as the opioids. Opioid really means anything which produces the effect of opium or its derivatives. So really properly what we should refer to here are the synthetic opioids. And the synthetic opioids, unfortunately, are currently funding an epidemic of drug addiction and deaths due to drug addiction right across the United States. And unfortunately, this has struck particularly at poorer rural areas where it has become a tremendous problem. So the drugs which we need to pay particular attention to, and which you'll hear referred to in any discussion about crime related to synthetic opioids, are these ones: OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet. These are all drugs. There are many others as well, which are similar. They're completely synthetic. They're not made from the opium poppy, but they have many of the same physiological effects as morphine or of heroin. They are powerful pain relievers. That's the first thing. And it's on that basis that they are very, very often prescribed. So heroin, morphine, and opium itself, these have been used for many thousands of years as pain relievers. They have been, for mankind, they have been the major pain reliever for many, many millennia. But of course, they have certain problems associated with them. First of all, at a dose high enough to relieve severe pain, those opiates also produce this high, a feeling of such intense relaxation, well-being that you actually can't lift your head. In other words, they have an incapacitating quality as well. You can't be on a high dose of morphine and be working machinery or driving a car. And so a goal of the pharmaceutical industry has for many years been to produce drugs which have those strong pain relieving qualities, but which don't produce that intense high that incapacitates people. And this is where many of these drugs arose. And it's a particular problem when they actually produce it for commercial purposes. And I'll just cite this as an example, and that is OxyContin. Now, OxyContin is a very powerful drug. It's a very, very powerful pain reliever. But when it was first produced and marketed, it was marketed to doctors as being a very low abuse potential. It was marketed as being not particularly addictive, unlike the opiates, which are highly addictive. The OxyContin was marketed specifically on the fact that it would produce these good effects, pain relief, but it would not have the bad effects of of addiction and abuse associated with it. Unfortunately, it was completely untrue. It turns out that OxyContin and these others, which are very, very similar, OxyContin, Vicodin, Percocet, turns out that they are, in fact, extremely addictive. And people can develop a very, very rapid addiction to them as well, because they do produce, along with the pain relief, they do produce a feeling of relaxation and well-being. It's not as profound as the opiates, like heroin, but nonetheless, it is marked, and it contributes to a very powerful psychological dependence, as well as a powerful physical dependence that quite rapidly develops. In addition, with continued use of these substances, the user develops tolerance. They need a higher and higher dose to achieve the same effects as they did before. So what happened in many, many areas of the country, doctors freely prescribed OxyContin and Vicodin and these things, and began to prescribe them not for severe pain, which is what the original intent was, but to prescribe them for ordinary pain. If people went to a dentist and had their wisdom teeth out, for example, the dentist would cheerfully give them 2 weeks worth of OxyContin. And then when they came back 2 weeks later and said, oh, could I get some more OxyContin? I've still got pain. And the dentist said, yes, sure, here's another. Let me give you a month. By that time, the person's already well on their way to developing a very powerful dependence. Now there's a problem, because now they have the dependence, they need actually a supply. If you go getting it through the doctor and through your medical insurance, everything, of course, it was affordable. And as long as you could carry on persuading your doctor to do that, to give you the prescription, you could probably manage, except for one thing, and that is the amount that people needed to take got higher and higher. Very soon, people who had developed such a dependency would turn to the street to get their supply. And on the street, it's very expensive. These pills cost a lot to buy illicitly. For many of these people, is very soon developed into a very serious addiction. Many people did manage or do manage to satisfy the addiction through the use of pills. But there is another solution, and that is that you can use an opiate. You can use heroin, for example, to provide the same feelings. And now, instead of using the pills that the addiction developed for, people can begin to use heroin from illegal street trade, which is very, very cheap compared to OxyContin. It's very cheap, but it's extremely dangerous, because heroin addiction carries with it the risk of incapacity. People lose the ability to hold down a job, do the work, etc., have the money to buy the drug, and their whole life becomes a cycle of chasing the drug, of trying to get a supply. The physical and psychological demands of addiction are enormous, absolutely enormous. And one of the great problems with these things like OxyContin, Vicodin, and heroin and everything else is this issue of tolerance. As people continue using, their dosage goes higher and higher and higher and higher. Many people will make repeated attempts to get off the drug. They may try to do it on their own and power through the agonizing withdrawal that they are going to go through, or else go into a rehab facility. Many rehab facilities will see people through the physical withdrawal, but not necessarily help them that much with the psychological. So they may be in a rehab for a couple of weeks or whatever, going through the physical withdrawal under managed circumstances, feel that they have come through the physical withdrawal and leave the facility and try to manage on their own for some days, some weeks, or whatever, and then relapse. And here's the really dangerous thing, because in the interim, during their rehabilitation, they have lost their tolerance. And now they go back to the streets to get a supply of drugs. And various things can happen. The most common thing that happens is they get a supply, say, of OxyContin or whatever it is that they are using. And they use the same dose that they had used before they went into rehab. And it's now far too high, and it's a fatal dose, and they overdose. And this is the origin of many, many overdose deaths. Many overdose deaths are associated with people who have relapsed after attempting to give up the drug. At a scene of where somebody has died, one of the first things that investigators will look for is drug paraphernalia, because if they die from overdose, it is usually very quick, very soon after they have injected. Not necessarily immediately, but it is usually very soon after they have injected what is now a fatal dose, which before they were completely tolerant of. There's one other problem, and that is when people buy from the street, they do not always know what they're getting. They may buy heroin or something like that, or they may buy OxyContin or something else that has actually been laced with another drug. And the most important one currently in forensic toxicology is this drug here, fentanyl. And fentanyl is a very, very powerful synthetic opioid. It is dealt illicitly and abused on its own. People do that. It's one of the things about fentanyl is that you can get fentanyl patches that you just put on your skin, and it diffuses into your skin. Very, very useful for pain management, for recalcitrant pain. People with a recalcitrant joint disease or cancer or something like this use fentanyl patches to great effect as a pain reliever. But it is extremely dangerous because it is so powerful, and is often used to adulterate heroin. And if a person does not know that their heroin has fentanyl in it and they inject it, they may very easily overdose, rapidly, quickly overdose and die. Okay, so here's another synthetic opioid. Please note in your notes it says opiate there. It should properly say opioid. It's a small point, but it's true. So this is the substance methadone. Methadone is very, very interesting because methadone is a synthetic opioid, but it has many physiological activities which are extremely similar to heroin, except that it does not produce the high that people get with heroin, nor does it produce the profound relaxation or somnolence that comes with heroin usage. And as a result, there are very few outward signs that somebody is using methadone. And people on methadone can, by and large, lead a completely normal life. This makes it very, very useful for people who are addicted to the opiates like heroin and morphine, who want to stop using them because it interferes with their day-to-day living. They can't make a living, etc. And they long-term want to transition off heroin, which is very, very difficult to do. So methadone will satisfy the craving that the addiction produces. It satisfies the craving and it stops all physical withdrawal symptoms. There's no incapacitating high, and it doesn't markedly impair a person's ability to lead a normal life. It has certain effects, but by and large, it allows an addict to return to a completely normal life. And the hope is that as they are involved in that normal life, they gradually will transition off, taper off even methadone use, and stop opioid use entirely. So methadone is a very useful drug, and it is, there are methadone clinics all over New York, for example, where heroin users can go regularly, every day or twice a day, if necessary, whatever they need, and receive a dose of methadone. It's taken orally, it's not injected, so it's very easy. And by and large, they can lead a pretty normal life. The only problem is that it has some of the disadvantages, and that is it is itself addictive. So it's difficult to do that withdrawal from the methadone itself, but it can be done. And it is a drug of abuse as well. People trade methadone with one another, but it does not produce this high unless it's taken at very, very high dosage, where it actually does become dangerous. But a very interesting, very useful drug in and of itself. There is abuse of methadone, and it is being seen on an increasing basis. Okay, so those are our opioids. Let's talk a little bit about hallucinogens, because this is going to be probably much more familiar, because the use of hallucinogens is so widespread. And hallucinogens interfere with the brain's ability to process and analyze sensory input. So we get receiving input to our brains, information about our environment the whole time, from sight, from hearing, from touch, from taste. Everything is all feeding in information about your environment. Processing of that information is extremely complex. Hearing, for example, when you hear something, there's part of your brain that registers that you are in fact hearing something, and a part of your brain that takes what you're hearing and sends the information to other parts of the brain. It relays it. There's parts of your brain that sort out what you are actually hearing. Then there's parts of your brain that, for example, if you're hearing words, there's a part of your brain that says you are hearing words, and here are the sounds of the words. And a part of your brain that actually itself listens to those sounds and says, this is what the words are saying. And another part of your brain says, this is what the words mean. Okay. So my point being that even a simple thing like hearing is actually very, very complex, and it involves many different areas of the brain. And there are pathways in the brain for all of those centers to coordinate and talk to one another so that you get the desirable end result. What hallucinogens do is they interfere with those pathways, and they do it to different degrees, and they do it with different pathways, and they interfere with our perception of the world around us, as we'll hear when we discuss particular hallucinogens. So they're going to change the normal thought processes. They're going to change your perception of your environment and of yourself, of your internal environment as well. And they also often powerfully affect mood, which is one of the reasons why people actually use them. They tend, not always, but they tend to produce feelings of well-being. So it may surprise you to learn that marijuana, weed, is a hallucinogen. But when you think about it, you think about the effects of marijuana, you'll realize why it is a hallucinogen. It's a hallucinogen because, for example, it interferes with your perception of time. and with other things as well. But for any of you who have used marijuana, immediately you know that is true, right? Your perception of time changes. An hour speeds by in a second, but seconds seem to have lasted for ages. Your brain is not analyzing time properly. That in itself can be a pleasurable feeling. Along with that feeling of well-being, of relaxation, and everything. It's typical effects of a hallucinogen. Now, marijuana actually is the most commonly used illicit drug in the United States. It's difficult now to talk about it now as being illicit because in many states it's being legalized. Formally, and very recently, it was illegal all over the United States, and there's still federal law. Even where states allow marijuana usage, there is federal law which forbids its usage. It's a very interesting legal situation. Marijuana is so widely used that even discussing it as being illegal, whatever, seems a little bit ludicrous. In addition, there is a very common perception about marijuana that it's essentially harmless. Well, harm comes in different forms, and it is certainly not harmless, and it is certainly not without risk, as we'll hear. So, there are very few studies on the long-term effects. There are some studies coming out now about its effects on lung capacity and things like that, which are not particularly good. I mean, the studies are good, but the results are not particularly cheering. There are very few studies on the long-term effects on your neurological function. There is anecdotal evidence, but not real hard evidence. I may mention a couple of the things as we go along. So the weed comes from a plant. It's called cannabis sativa. It's been grown for thousands and thousands of years, not necessarily for the extraction of weed. It's an extremely useful plant. It's used for many different things. Its major usage in agriculture has been for the production of textiles. It produces a fiber which produces a very strong textile. And for example, real linen is produced from this plant. When it's grown for this purposes, it's often referred to as flax. And that has been its major usage. But there are these strains of cannabis sativa which produce this substance, tetrahydrocannabinol. Not all cannabis sativa plants will produce it, but there are strains of the plant which do. And this is the substance, tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. That is the psychoactive product, and it's contained in the sap. It gets concentrated in the sap of the plant, and it is activated by heat. It always has to be heated in some form, at least once. It can be cool when you use it, but it has to have been heated at some point in its lifespan. That's why it works when you smoke it, and it works if you have edibles which have been cooked, because the THC has been activated. That is the one. THC is the main psychoactive. But many of the plants do not produce tetrahydrocannabinol. Many of the strains of cannabis do not produce it, like the one that's used for textile production, fiber production. But they do produce this. It's cannabidiol. I always have to try and make sure I say it in as American an accent as I possibly can, otherwise nobody understands what I'm saying. It's also just referred to as CBD. And this is a substance which has no psychoactive properties. It has no hallucinogenic properties, I would say, but it is touted as having all sorts of health benefits. It's very unclear whether those are true. It's sold for all sorts of things. It's sold for arthritis, to help with sleep, to help with anxiety, all sorts of things. It's very, very unclear whether any of these reputed health benefits for CBD are actually true or not. If it works for you, it works for you. That's all I'll say. Now here's the plant. This is the old-fashioned plant. This is what, in my long-distant youth, this is what we would automatically recognize. And in fact, this is what we would have smoked. It was the leaves and buds, the flowers of the plant. That was what you used. But certain strains of the plant produce flower buds in very dense clusters at the top of the stalk like this. The flower buds, it's always been known, the flower buds are very rich in the saps and in the resin that contains the psychoactive substances. So through artificial breeding, they have begun to produce plants which are almost entirely composed of these densely packed flower buds. They're rather like a cannabis cauliflower. And these are referred to as buds. And these are the buds that you buy. Somebody offers you buds, this is what you're buying. It's dried flower buds, which are packed full of the resin, which containing the psychoactive substances. Here they are here. Now, 15, 20 years ago, longer, the amount of THC in these plants was actually relatively low. But through artificial breeding, the potency of plants has become higher and higher and higher and higher. Modern marijuana plants contain orders of magnitude higher concentrations of THC than wild type of plants that were once used. This has made commercial marijuana growing much easier, because you can just sell a small amount like this, and it will fund a long time of smoking or whatever. So the modern marijuana is very, very much more potent. You can also just extract the resins through some really quite simple processes, and concentrate the resin alone away from plant material, and that is called hashish. And that has been done for many, many centuries to concentrate the THCs. So the effects of marijuana are to produce a feeling, first of all, of relaxation, a feeling of well-being, and usually a feeling of anxiety release. They're anxiolytic. They dispel anxiety. Usually. Occasionally, they, even in somebody who regularly uses marijuana, just suddenly, these hallucinatory processes are somewhat unpredictable. Sometimes it can trip over into something else and start sending in messages through another neural pathway, and you end up actually beginning to feel intensely anxious. And that can be extremely unpleasant. That's what a bad trip is like. It's intense anxiety and everything. If that happens to you, just tell yourself the whole time, this is fake. This is just fake. Your brain is thinking all sorts of things that are just not true, and it will go. You'll metabolize it, and it will go. Along with this, there are distortions of the sense of time. There's distortions, especially interestingly with marijuana, of body space. We normally have a very clear idea of where our bodies begin and where they end, where we sit in space. In fact, we have neural receptors all over us, which are sending that information to our brains to place ourselves in three-dimensional space the whole time. But marijuana distorts this. And that's the origin, you know, the thing. Hey man, you ever seen your hand? Have you ever really looked at your hand? It's a real thing of suddenly the body, this body image comes into a different focus because your marijuana is distorting your ability to perceive your body in space. There are also changes in taste, hearing, and very powerfully, it will produce hunger, the munchies. This is one of these all are actually quite useful properties as well, which is the origin of using marijuana in medicinal settings. It is powerful, can be used very successfully as in medicinal settings. And one of the things, for example, is to use marijuana to help people, for example, who are being treated with chemotherapy, who are suffering from nausea and loss of appetite. The marijuana relieves the nausea and it increases the appetite. So that's very, very useful. Now, under normal circumstances, most people don't use marijuana at very high dose. And also usually don't use it continuously. It's often a social thing. So occasional usage at moderate dosages don't cause problems. It tends just to produce these feelings of well-being and interest and all the rest of it. You'll also know probably that one of the things that happens, it distorts your ability to know what is funny and what is not funny. And, little mild jokes become absolutely hilarious. All of these things, it's good social stuff, right? It's very similar to the reason, for example, that we use alcohol. But just like alcohol, it can trip over into something else. And marijuana does carry with it a strong tendency for psychological dependence. People begin to feel, for example, that they need the weed the whole time so that they don't become anxious, etc. But there are some warning things which should strike us, especially at high dosage. Because at high dosage, when people really take a lot, then they can actually trip over into really florid, hallucinatory experience. With marijuana, the hallucinations are very often oral. It's hearing things and things like that. Feeling things as well. Feeling suddenly extremely paranoid, feeling that something bad is going to happen. There's something there that isn't there. These are all hallucinations, but they can, at high dosage, they can be terrifyingly real. And there is a lot of question about what the impact of these kinds of things are on long-term mental health. There is some indication that this may trigger latent mental illness, for example, latent depression, latent bipolar disorder. This sort of thing can be triggered by experiences such as this. The psychological dependency can be profound in some people, but there is very little evidence of marijuana producing any physical dependency. And nonetheless, those people who have developed a profound psychological dependency, it's very difficult to deal with, very difficult to get them to stop usage entirely. The one thing I will tell you, and it's anybody who's taught for a very long time will surely have anecdotal evidence of this view, is that people who begin smoking marijuana regularly and at relatively high, then increasing the dosage to relatively high dosage, the one thing that does happen is it appears that it is a demotivator. all of the impulses, what we would classify as being ambition or wanting to do well or wanting to succeed, everything else seem to dissipate. And I think everybody who has taught many students will have those stories of the brilliant student who suddenly began getting really appallingly bad grades, etc. And it turned out that they were using marijuana very regularly. But certainly the marijuana may be a cause, but it may be a contributor. There may be another reason why people are using marijuana. That may be that they themselves are suffering from depression. But the thing is that sometimes the impacts of long-term marijuana use look very similar to depression. So the two feed into one another. It is definitely a drug which many people use with no ill effect. I'd say most people use with ill effect, but always bear in mind that it does definitely have the potential for bad effect as well. So the other hallucinogens, there's a big list of them. There are many now, which many of them synthetic. Many of them get synthesized. It seems like every year there's a new set of hallucinogens that get produced. But these are the ones you'll most commonly hear about. LSD. LSD is synthetic, but it was modeled on a naturally occurring molecule. And it was the first synthetic hallucinogen. Lysergic acid diethylamide is its full name. LSD is how we all know it. Others, mescaline. Mescaline also is derived from cactus plants. PCP is completely synthetic. And psilocybin is the active substance in mushrooms, in shrooms. The one which is very, very, very common now, especially, well, less with now that there aren't any clubs open, but the club drugs, and the most famous one is MDMA or ecstasy. And these are all hallucinogens as well. They all have some way of distorting perceptual reality. And each of them with their distinct characteristics. The most famous one of all, of course, is LSD, because it was the first. It was synthesized in the 1950s and became popular in the 1960s. And it has extremely profound effects on perceptual ability and causes vivid hallucinations. They are often very entertaining, and when you try to analyze people's hallucinations, you will very often find they contain elements of the real environment, which have been plucked out and put into novel kind of framework. So people are like sitting watching their own internal movie in a way when they see these hallucinations. And people in general were entertained by this. And LSD also has this effect, it scrambles the senses to a certain extent. So people begin to see music, or colors produce particular sounds. All of these sort of things people find interesting, entertaining, and illuminating, I suppose, would be the way to think of it. Unfortunately, LSD, again, can produce quite catastrophic effects sometimes, in that it is temporary, but it can produce very, very profound, bad hallucinations associated with terror, and also, people see terrible, terrible things and can actually be really badly affected by it. It's also a question of a dosage as well. It's more likely at higher dosage. This is an old-fashioned tab. Each of these here is a little tab of LSD. You take one, for a, just an ordinary trip. 2 if you really experience. 3 if you want to blast the top of your head off, that sort of thing. Other hallucinogens. Hallucinogens in general tend not to be particularly dangerous, but here is one which is, and this is phencyclidine. It's also called angel dust. It operates on its own. In some ways, rather like as we'll hear in a minute about it, rather like a stimulant. It gives people a sense of power, of that they are Superman, that this superwoman can, just conquer all problems and everything else. But it is actually a hallucinogen, and on its own, it's a pretty dangerous drug. But very often it was mixed. It would be mixed into with other substances, and for example, people would smoke marijuana laced with PCP. A very, very, very dangerous. These combinations could be extremely dangerous and lead people into very, very dangerous situations. For example, that could produce profound alterations of personality. A mild, gentle person who suppressed anger probably for most of their life, on a PCP suddenly becomes a raging bull. They suddenly feel like, well, I can conquer and kill everything that's ever troubles me, and they may attempt to do so. So PCP is associated with violent crime, and it is classically associated with social situations which go wildly wrong. People smoking PCP suddenly get into a fight and end up killing one another. That would be typical. The other thing that was dangerous about PCP, and this applies to some of the stimulants as well, is it produces this intense, very rapid high, but that high does not last. And when it ends, the person crashes into a profound depression, the exact opposite of the high that they just enjoyed. And that may be so profound, they are driven then to take drug again. So it becomes a self-perpetuating, and is also being strongly implicated in production or exacerbation of existing mental illness. So this phencyclidine, for example, is strongly implicated in the development of bipolar disorder. Okay, here's another one. Now, these are shrooms, mushrooms. They're also sometimes called blueies because they have a strange characteristic. These mushrooms, when you handle them or bruise them, they turn blue. They develop a distinct blue color. Magic mushrooms have also been used for many, many millennia. Human beings have been eating them for the effects that they produce. In general, they're taken recreationally, and that they have a very interesting characteristic, which seems to be in common to all of. There are various of these mushrooms that can produce this, but they all seem to have this characteristic that they seem to produce a feeling of intense environmental connectedness, where the other hallucinogens distort our connection to the environment. The substance psilocybin, which is the active substance in mushrooms, seems to increase people's attachment to their environment, and they often feel placed in the environment, and they often can produce profound religious experience, mystical experience. And for that reason, we believe that it has been used in religious ceremony for many, many thousands of years. It's also now, interestingly enough, has been found to have a very powerful antidepressant effect, and its use medicinally is being very carefully examined. In general, this is fairly benign. This is a benign drug use. It does not have strong psychological or physical dependency associated with it. And many states are considering legalizing mushroom use along with marijuana use. There are many interesting stories about psilocybin and, for instance, its association with religion, which you can research on your own if you wish to do so. Okay, so more on our hurried survey of all the different kinds of drugs. Here comes some of the most important in terms of crime within the United States, and these are the stimulants. There's many different stimulants, many of them, but the most important ones are sets of synthetic stimulants, the amphetamines, which also called uppers or speed, and then cocaine, which is a naturally occurring product. It's a product of a plant. And these two together, the amphetamines and cocaine, have contributed to a crime wave, I suppose we'd call it, which has endured in the United States for many decades. And the stimulants are substances which will increase your sense of alertness. They increase activity. They tend to make people feel supernormal. And they have certain drawbacks that they may be profoundly anxiety producing as well. Along with stimulation and everything else, they may increase anxiety and loss of appetite, etc. But here is one of the things about them, is they reduce a sense of fatigue. And even in people who are genuinely fatigued and genuinely sleep deprived and everything else, use of amphetamines overcomes that and gets them active again. So amphetamines have been a drug of choice. For example, in the armed forces for many years, they were legally used in the Second World War, for example, on both sides, and are still used to increase the amount of time that people can spend in active and alert. It has a cost, of course, and that is that when the drug wears off, the person is now even more fatigued, even more tired than they were before, and it may, in fact, amount to absolute exhaustion that they haven't registered. So the amphetamines on their own, these speed uppers are available just as tablets or whatever, that can be used in various ways. They can be taken as tablets or crushed and processed and injected as well. This substance here is one which is relatively, it has been known for a long time, but its use and abuse has become common relatively recently, and that is methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, or crystal, is a typical amphetamine, very powerfully upper, very powerfully stimulant, but it has, for an addict, the advantage that it can be smoked. It can also be injected, but it can be smoked, and it can be smoked in a pipe where it is vaporized, inhaled, and then whatever is left will recrystallize out on the glass of the pipe. So it's very economically efficient. That is one of the things which has driven its use. Very powerful amphetamine, and extremely difficult to get off. It's very easy to become addicted and very difficult to get off. And it's widely known as crystal because of this, the way it behaves in a glass pipe. One of the huge disadvantages of methamphetamine is that when a person comes off the drug, it could produce a period of exhaustion and a prolonged bout of depression. and this increases the risk that the person will reuse. And people can go for days and days and days with absolutely no sleep on crystal meth. So there's very, very high potential for addiction. But surprisingly enough, when you examine the addiction, you find that most of the impact appears to be psychological. There is dispute about the amount of physical impact of the drug, physical dependency. Most people will tell you that, in fact, there is very little physical dependence, but don't forget psychological dependence can be extremely powerful. All of these stimulant addictions are amongst the most difficult for a person to escape from. The comparison between the feeling of alertness, power, etc., that they produce and the normal life is so vast that normal life just begins to seem like dull boredom compared to the effects that the stimulant produces. So one of the most widespread and still popular of the stimulants, of course, is cocaine itself. Cocaine is extracted from a plant called erythroxylin, which grows in South America. And the plant leaves themselves can be chewed. That is their traditional usage in South America. They are chewed to relieve fatigue, to relieve hunger, and also to avoid altitude sickness, for instance, in the Andes. And the substance itself, the stimulant, is a substance called an alkaloid, which is present in the cells and the sap of the plant, and it can be extracted, and can be extracted and purified, and that is the pure white cocaine that people use, usually to sniff. They usually sniff it up the nose to get its effect. In general, its usage is occasional. Most people, it is occasional and very often social as well. And for all of the same reasons, it makes people feel alert and happy and powerful, and relieves all social anxiety, etc., etc. But a very high dosage has the same disadvantages. It can produce intense anxiety, paranoia, etc. Now, the trade in cocaine in the United States is just huge. It still is absolutely huge. It is all imported because the plant does not grow anywhere in the continental United States. Most of it grows in South America, and it gets trafficked north, and its distribution and trade is completely illegal. It's in fact quite difficult. It can be used medically, by the way, but it's only done so under very, very, very strict and difficult circumstances. A lot of people use cocaine. They say here, estimated 6 million people worldwide. I would venture to say that is probably a gross underestimate. The trade is worth billions upon billions of dollars. And remember, this is all illegal trade. So it has all of the associations of an illegal trade. Everybody has to be bought off. Everybody has to be paid. And this is why pure cocaine is extremely expensive and extremely expensive to use. And its use in general, pure cocaine is used by an elite who can afford it. So again, like many of the stimulants, it appears to have very low physical dependency, but the psychological dependence can become profound. For many people, you do it occasionally and it's not a problem. But for others, it becomes a daily, hourly, multi-hourly demand that they use the cocaine. And as with many dependencies, the tolerance increases and the need to use increases and increases and increases. And this whole syndrome just looks like a real addiction. Because it does not have a true physical dependency, it's often referred to as cocaine use disorder rather than addiction itself. But it has all of the symptoms and associations of addiction. So I'm always somewhat reluctant to use these kinds of figures, but I would use them with the caveat that I think that they're probably all gross underestimates. These are very difficult. It's very difficult to determine how many people use cocaine, because if you ask people, do you ever use cocaine? Many people are going to say no, even though they do. So these are all probably underestimates. 6 million Americans under the age of 12, under the age of 12, over the age of 12, admitted to using cocaine in the year 2017. So that's 6 million, that's a lot. That's a hefty proportion of the adult population are using cocaine. That does not tell you how often they use it. And for most of those people, it's probably relatively occasional. But cocaine usage, in fact, is becoming more and more popular. And we could discuss reasons why. We can discuss reasons why, for instance, people feel the need to take things that make them feel powerful and competent and assured, right? There are good reasons in our society that would encourage many of us to take a drug which made us feel like that. And that is probably the attraction of cocaine. But we always have to realize the person using it once a year at a fancy party, sniffing it off a table, behind the line of cocaine on the table that they are sniffing is a huge number of people who have been caught up in the illegal trade. There are a huge number of people who've been murdered and killed and have died in order to put that line of cocaine on somebody's table. It is not a cost-free indulgence. But it says 136,000 teens, adolescents, 12 to 17 misused cocaine. Now look at that, 12 to 17. That's new and young teenagers are misusing cocaine. This is not, compared to the whole population, it's not a huge number, but nonetheless, we need to be aware that it is penetrated that far. Just millions and millions of people are engaged in using cocaine. The highest usage, unsurprisingly, is in people 26 to 34. Why unsurprisingly? Well, because this is when many people are first achieving their high income. Okay, they've passed their college, they've passed their internships and everything else. Now they're in their good jobs, and now they're getting disposable income, right? And at the same time, they're ambitious and they're networking with rich people. They're networking with trying to make their way socially and etc. So it's unsurprising that this age group cocaine usage is at its highest. But out of this group, many of whom will just be absolutely fine and do it occasionally, there is going to be a substantial number who do become psychologically dependent and suffer both psychological and physical effects of constant cocaine usage. There are still a substantial number of people who maintain cocaine usage throughout their lives. They don't magically stop at 34. But 34, many people have got their family, they got a sense of responsibility, they don't feel the need for it anymore, they're assured in their lives. and it passes into history for them. Other people continue to abuse for their whole lives. But in a single year, we look how many people are reporting for treatment, how many people are self-reporting, self-identifying as having cocaine use disorder. It's really substantial. Nearly 1 million people in a year would say, I have a problem, a real problem with cocaine usage. So refined cocaine like that is expensive. It is expensive, and it is actually quite difficult to get. There's a whole sociology to the production and distribution of cocaine like that. Here's another problem. We're not going to discuss it today. I'll finish discussing it at our next. And that is what happened when cocaine usage moved from a relatively small elite who could afford it to do it into wider society, because it was made more potent, and most importantly, it was made cheap. And this was the terrible advent of this drug, crack. Crack is nothing but cocaine. It's cocaine which is processed in a particular way to make it so potent that you only need to use a very small amount of it to get a very profound effect, rather than refined cocaine, which is relatively inefficient in terms of the high it produces. It's relatively inefficient compared to crack. Crack is processed so that it is much, much more potent. And we'll discuss that next time.